A millionaire brought his maid to a business dinner, but what she did upon arrival left everyone stunned. Grace had been working at Daniel Carter's mansion for almost 3 years. She took pride in her job, but never once expected he'd pull her aside for such an odd and unexpected request. Daniel, a prominent and rather distant businessman, was in a tight spot with his company and needed to impress a few influential investors at a dinner that evening. Running out of options and patience to find a proper guest, he glanced at Grace, who was dusting the shelves in his office, and said in a commanding tone, "I need you to join me at an important dinner tonight. This isn't an invitation. It's a directive. Show up and be discreet. I need someone who won't draw attention or have opinions of their own." Grace was taken aback, but hid her reaction. His request felt more like a direct order. Yet she sensed this might be her chance to prove herself in some way. She agreed, feeling a mix of tension and anticipation. This wouldn't be just any evening. Arriving at the restaurant on time, dressed elegantly, Grace saw Daniel waiting at the door, looking restless. He barely acknowledged her, grumbling, "Let's go," as if she were nothing more than a necessary add-on. As they walked into the upscale restaurant, Grace could feel all eyes on them. The investors, gathered around a central table, took note. Daniel introduced her in a clipped tone, not even bothering with her last name. "This is Grace. She's with me tonight," he stated, quickly looking away. The investors, all in sharp suits and with appraising looks, gave polite smiles, though some exchanged subtle glances of surprise. It was clear they didn't expect someone like Grace at the table, and their silent judgments were obvious. Grace noticed every look, but held her composure. Through the meal, she listened quietly while Daniel and the investors discussed finances, expansion strategies, and projections. Grace stayed silent, observing closely and soaking up every detail. At one moment, one of the investors, Mr. Butler, a tall man with a commanding presence, turned to her with a faintly mocking smile. "So, Grace, how does it feel to attend a business dinner like this?" he asked, his tone suggesting he expected her to be overwhelmed. Grace sensed the tension around the table. She could have just given a polite, meaningless reply, but instead she chose to stand her ground. "Actually, it's pretty eye-opening to see how everything works firsthand," she replied calmly. "The focus on financial details and projections is important, but I think it's just as crucial to understand the people driving those numbers." The room fell silent. Grace stayed composed, while Daniel's expression showed a blend of surprise and frustration. She had just demonstrated she had a voice, something he had instructed her to suppress. Mr. Butler, caught off guard by her boldness, let out a brief, amused chuckle. "An interesting perspective," he said, while the other investors looked at her with a newfound interest. Daniel's expression tensed, as he became obviously annoyed by the attention Grace was starting to get. The evening was turning out to be anything but low-key, completely contrary to his plans. Yet Grace seemed to be discovering her own voice in a setting that, until then, hadn't seemed welcoming. As dinner continued, she held her ground, even as Daniel grew more unsettled. She was at the table, and he avoided looking at her directly. But Mr. Butler only seemed more drawn to involving Grace in the discussion, perhaps because she was the only one defying expectations in this setting. When the conversation shifted to social responsibility, a topic that seemed to make Daniel even more uncomfortable, Grace saw a chance to speak up. "Has Mr. Carter given thought to social initiatives within his company?" Mr. Butler asked, glancing slyly at Daniel. Daniel hesitated, looking uneasy. Before he could offer a vague reply, Grace, keeping her composure, responded directly. "I believe social initiatives are a way for a company to give back to the community that supported its growth. After all, There's more to business than just profit. It would be a meaningful move. Silence settled over the room, with every gaze fixed on Grace. Rather than retreating, she kept a calm and composed expression, standing firm on her principles. To her, this was about staying true to herself. Mr. Butler, clearly impressed, offered a smile. "Exactly my thoughts, Grace. You don't hear that kind of honesty around here often," he commented, intentionally challenging Daniel. Daniel's face tightened. He had brought Grace to this dinner, expecting her to blend into the background, but now she was drawing attention he hadn't anticipated. Irritated, he decided to steer the evening in a different direction. "It's easy to have opinions when you're not the one making tough leadership decisions." "Grace," he said, with a slight dismissive smirk, "don't you think you're speaking on something beyond your experience?" Grace met Daniel's gaze, recognizing the challenge in his tone. Yet she stood her ground. "Maybe I don't bear the weight of leadership decisions, but I understand their impact. Sometimes, those who aren't at the top have a clearer view of what's happening below." Her response was bold and caught everyone off guard. Her confidence made Mr. Butler chuckle, and the other investors exchanged admiring looks. Grace's poise had quickly shifted the atmosphere of the evening, leaving Daniel in stunned silence as he struggled to regain control. Though he masked his discomfort, it was clear he felt undermined. To Daniel, this was a betrayal. When the dinner wrapped up, he didn't wait for Grace, walking out ahead and leaving her on her own. But Grace didn't mind. She knew she'd stayed true to herself, and her voice had been heard. That was what mattered. Yet she had no idea that Daniel wouldn't let the events of that night slide. Back at the mansion, Daniel's frustration was barely contained. The moment Grace entered, he summoned her to his office, forgoing any pleasantries. His eyes were dark with anger. "What were you thinking, Grace?" he snapped, hardly waiting for her to sit. "I invited you to support me quietly, not to steal the spotlight." Grace, still composed despite the intensity of the evening, kept her calm. She knew this conversation wouldn't go well, yet she stood by her actions. "All I did was answer a question, Mr. Daniel. I simply shared my opinion," she said, her voice steady. "Opinion?" He shot her a scornful look. "You're a housekeeper, Grace. You're not paid to have an opinion at a business dinner. You crossed the line, overstepped completely." She held her breath, feeling the sting of his words. Daniel couldn't grasp her drive or her desire to prove she could offer more than her assigned role. To him, she'd always be just the housekeeper. "If my presence bothered you so much, why bring me along?" Grace asked, her voice steady but unyielding. "Don't start with that. You were there to work and stay quiet. That's part of your paycheck," Daniel replied, his tone icy and final. "Consider this your last day. You're fired." His words hit like a final blow, but Grace kept her composure, refusing to show how much it hurt. She simply nodded, preserving her pride, stood up, and walked away. Leaving the mansion, she felt relief knowing she'd never again endure Daniel's disdain. That night, Grace found clarity about her own worth and potential. Though abrupt, this firing felt like a doorway to something new. The next morning, while she packed her things, an unexpected call came. It was Mr. Butler, an investor who had noticed her courage at the dinner. He wanted her on his team, an offer she never dreamed of receiving. Surprised and excited, Grace accepted without hesitation. What felt like Daniel's attempt to humiliate her had turned into the opportunity of a lifetime. Over the next few months, Grace thrived in her new role. Under Mr. Butler's mentorship, she unlocked talents she'd never had the chance to develop in her previous job. Her dedication and leadership quickly earned her the respect of her peers, and she became a valued member of the company. Finally, she was in an environment where her voice mattered. Here's a little game for those who read the comments. Type hamburger if you've made it this far. Now, back to the story. Meanwhile, Daniel's situation was about to take a turn for the worse. The trouble at his company was deepening. Rash moves, made purely for short-term gain, were taking a heavy toll. Daniel's pride had cost him key contracts and driven off valuable partners. Things took a sharp turn when the firm where Grace now worked bought a significant share of Daniel's business, placing her in a high-ranking role directly connected to his operations. They crossed paths again at a big corporate gathering. Daniel stepped into the room, his face draining of color, when he spotted Grace seated confidently among the top brass. He paused, staring at her, as if grappling with the idea that his former housekeeper was now part of the leadership circle. Grace met his look, unwavering but calm, with no trace of bitterness. Her focus was on her new role and the impact she could make. This was only the beginning of the tension. After the meeting, Daniel approached her, his expression hard and brimming with disbelief and irritation. "Grace," he muttered, trying to keep his composure. "So you're with them now?" Grace didn't flinch, keeping her cool despite his reaction. "Yes, as you can see, we acquired a substantial part of your company." Daniel laughed derisively, trying to cover his discomfort. "This is absurd. You think having a title here means you understand real leadership?" Grace's tone remained steady. "Daniel, working for you taught me exactly what not to do to lead a team and how to ignore the kind of arrogance that blinds people. Quite the lesson." He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers, but she didn't budge. "Don't think this changes anything between us. You're still just a lucky housekeeper," he sneered. Grace folded her arms, holding his gaze, her voice strong. "That's where you're wrong, Daniel. I don't need your respect. I earned my place. Luck had nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, you're watching your empire crumble because you've never valued anything beyond yourself." Daniel was momentarily speechless, the exchange laying bare the weaknesses he'd long ignored. Someone he had previously dismissed as unimportant caused him. He saw clearly the self-destructive path he was on, and it stung. Grace was no longer just a rival. She was the reflection he dreaded, exposing his weaknesses without hesitation. Her words replayed in his mind, a truth he wished he hadn't been forced to confront. After their encounter, he could no longer ignore the reckless decisions that had led him toward financial disaster. Daniel felt the weight of his own ego, the same arrogance that had driven away loyal employees, reliable partners, and even his family. That evening, instead of immersing himself in desperate schemes to salvage what remained, he found himself reflecting on every impulsive decision he'd made. Days later, Daniel and Grace were summoned to an investor meeting. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The fate of his company rested on the outcome of this gathering. Daniel, nervous and drained, walked in trying to project confidence. Grace was already there, composed, flipping through documents. Once seated, the lead investor addressed Daniel bluntly. "Your company's current state is dire, Daniel. A drastic change is needed, and soon. Understand, this is your last opportunity to persuade the board you're fit to lead and turn this around." A lump formed in Daniel's throat, but he worked to hold his composure. He presented new strategies and ideas, attempting to assert control. Yet it was clear his approach was still shallow, fixated solely on short-term gains. The investors shared skeptical glances, recognizing the same short-sightedness that had brought him to this point. Then Grace spoke, catching everyone off guard with her insight. "This company needs a new focus," she said. "We can't just chase profits anymore. We have to reconnect with the people, which means real dedication to social responsibility and valuing our employees." The investors looked at one another, visibly intrigued, as the board leaders nodded for Grace to continue. Grace spoke with confidence, laying out the benefits of blending social initiatives with a more people-centered approach to the business, which would not only create a lasting positive impact, but also secure a sustainable future. Sitting beside her, Daniel felt a wave of helplessness. He could see not just the self-assurance behind Grace's every word, but also the respect she was earning from the investors. The reality was undeniable. He was losing his grip on the company he once controlled, and Grace was stepping up to save it. When the meeting concluded, it was clear the investors felt more assured about Grace's proposed direction. As they exited, Daniel paused in the hallway. Grace noticed and turned back to him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "Why would you help me save this company?" Grace met his gaze, taking a steady breath before responding. "Because, unlike you, I believe in people, Daniel. And even more, I believe this company has a future, whether you're in it or not." Her words struck him like a cold shock, leaving him silent as their meaning sank in. For the first time, Daniel felt something beyond his usual pride and independence. He felt a genuine need to change, to become a better person. Grace gave him a brief look before she walked away. Watching her go, Daniel realized that this woman, whom he had once overlooked, had now become his strongest influence. He couldn't shake her words from his mind. He understood he'd made plenty of mistakes, but it felt as if Grace was silently judging him with each step. While he yearned to prove he could improve, he also saw Grace as a reminder of everything he hadn't achieved. The tension between them grew thicker each day. Grace's polished professionalism and insightful comments often cut through his intentions before he could voice them, and this unnerved him. That week, a critical meeting was scheduled with the board of investors. With the company's finances hanging by a thread, Daniel knew a single misstep could mean disaster. He was determined to show strong leadership and, just maybe, demonstrate to Grace that he still had something valuable to offer. On the day of the meeting, Grace arrived early, meticulously preparing the presentation. Daniel, meanwhile, had crafted a separate speech, something he planned to introduce mid-meeting as a bold move. He was convinced this approach would be enough to impress the board and prove his commitment. As the meeting commenced, Grace laid out her plan to secure steady growth while safeguarding resources. Daniel noticed that the board seemed to lean in her favor. Despite this, he held firm to his own vision. "I get where Grace is coming from," Daniel said, interrupting just as she reached a key point in her presentation. "But I believe we should be bolder with our expansion. We need to make it clear to the Michelet that we're stepping into a new era." Grace looked at him, a blend of surprise and disappointment in her expression. She knew he was making a statement, but this was not the time for personal ambition. Keeping her voice steady, she replied, "Daniel, you remember that this aggressive approach has led us into trouble before. Our focus now is restructuring, putting our mission above rapid growth." The board watched the back and forth with interest, visibly divided, but Daniel, unwilling to concede, pressed on. "Grace, I understand your caution, but without taking risks, we'll settle into mediocrity that will eventually drag us down. The company needs to stand out and show results." Grace kept her calm, shaking her head. "The company needs stability, Daniel. The communities we're working with rely on a sustainable approach. We're beyond the point where we act based on the personal agendas of our leaders." The tension was thick in the room. Some members of the board exchanged approving looks with Grace, while others seemed open to Daniel's arguments. Mr. Lindsay, the board president, finally intervened, asking both to bring a unified proposal to the next meeting. Grace nodded, her expression composed, but Daniel felt a twinge of defeat. He realized he was losing his grip on the company he had once built. That evening, He stayed late at the office, poring over financial statements, trying to reframe his proposal in a way that would make it more appealing. His mind buzzed with ideas, but each one seemed to risk the project's integrity. Then, a message popped up from an old acquaintance, a businessman offering a substantial investment in exchange for a minor role in shaping the company's community projects. To Daniel, it looked like the perfect solution. He'd secure the needed funds and prove to Grace that he too could act in the company's best interest. Without consulting Grace or the board, he arranged a meeting with the potential investor. The following day, he laid out his ambitious growth plans, and within just a few hours, he sealed an initial deal. Daniel felt victorious. Finally, something tangible to showcase his leadership potential. But Grace's reaction was anything but supportive. As soon as she found out about the deal, she headed straight to Daniel's office. He was on a video call with the new investor, animatedly discussing expansion ideas. When he saw Grace walk in, his stomach twisted uncomfortably. She looked furious, and he knew he was in for it. When the call ended, Grace folded her arms, fixing him with a glare that made his pulse race. "You made a deal without the board's approval. How could you?" Daniel took a steadying breath, ready to explain his side. "Grace, this was an opportunity. We need this funding to grow. I'm trying to protect the company just like you." She shook her head, clearly frustrated. "Protect the company? Do you even realize the risk you've taken? This investor now has influence over our community projects. What happens when he starts steering them in his own direction?" Daniel tried to keep his composure. "It's a manageable risk, Grace. He only has a minor stake. Nothing more." Her eyes narrowed. "And what about our commitment to putting people first, to being transparent? This isn't the kind of leadership we agreed to pursue." Her words struck him like a blow, leaving him feeling exposed, vulnerable, and resentful of Grace's constant disapproval. "Why do you always expect me to mess up? I'm doing my best, Grace. I want to do the right thing." Grace took a deep breath, her gaze softening slightly, but her voice stayed firm. "It's not about hoping you fail, Daniel. It's about you understanding the consequences of your actions. Leadership isn't only about big moves. It's about accountability. Acting behind the scenes just shows that you still don't get that." Daniel looked away, feeling the weight of her words sink in. Maybe I'll never understand it the way you need me to, Grace." She nodded, as if she'd already prepared herself for that answer. "Maybe. And until you do," she replied, "you'll just keep breaking those same promises. Believe me, that's a weight no one can bear forever." 2 weeks later, the board convened to review a deal Daniel had pushed through without their approval. Concerns about the deal's potential impact were heavy in the air. When the meeting began, Grace wasted no time voicing her objections. "This contract, Michael's a departure from the values we've worked hard to uphold. We now have an outside investor with influence over our social initiatives, and I trust everyone here understands the risks involved." Mr. Lindsay, listening intently to Grace, turned to Daniel. "Can you explain the reasoning behind this choice?" Daniel felt a lump in his throat, but tried to keep his cool. "I believe this investment could offer the financial stability we need to expand and ensure the project's long-term sustainability." The board president interrupted with a hard tone. "Daniel, this isn't just about money. We have a mission here that can't be compromised. You acted rashly." Daniel felt the pressure rising. He glanced at Grace, whose face showed nothing but disappointment. It hit him. He hadn't just lost the board's confidence. He'd squandered his last chance to prove he could change. At the meeting's close, the board agreed to review Daniel's authority, possibly limiting his role in future decisions. He left the room in silence, defeated. In that moment, He recognized that if he was serious about changing, he'd have to set his pride aside. Grace wasn't just challenging his choices, she was offering him a new way to lead. And for the first time, Daniel began to see that the type of leadership he'd practiced had no place here anymore. Back home after the meeting, Daniel found himself on the brink of an emotional breakdown. His home, once a symbol of success, felt hollow and cold. He had invested years in building a solid career, crafting a powerful reputation, and now everything seemed to be slipping away. He understood it wasn't the board or Grace to blame. The fault lay with his own actions. Everything he and Grace had tried to build was now crumbling because of his impulsive, stubborn decisions. There was no more running from the truth. The same selfish impulses had always driven Daniel, who made snap decisions without taking anyone else into account. His behavior was isolating him not only from his team and the board, but most importantly, from Grace. Daniel arrived at the office early the following morning, weighed down by a profound sense of emptiness and regret. He knew he needed to understand the true motives behind his actions. He sat down in his office amid a mountain of reports and memos, facing his own reflection rather than Grace or the board. For the first time, he began to really question his choices. Grace's words from the recent meeting echoed in his mind. She had challenged his perspective, not just as a CEO, but as a person. "You're still treating this company like it's only about profit," she had said. Now, those words carried a new significance, pushing him to consider what genuine leadership might look like. As he surveyed the quiet office space, he realized his leadership style had likely missed the Michael. Maybe he had only been playing a part, the role of a ruthless, profit-driven businessman who believed numbers alone defined success. But now, as he grappled with the potential loss of his role and the trust of those he once led, he started to see that leadership had to transcend the numbers on a balance sheet. That afternoon, Grace appeared at his door. Her expression was firm, but there was a softened edge he hadn't noticed before. Perhaps she was seeing a different side of him. Exhausted by all the conflicts, Daniel chose honesty. "Grace," he began, his voice unsteady, "I know I've made some serious mistakes. I realize now how my choices have hurt others, maybe in ways I can't fully repair. And I get it, if you think it's too late for me to try." Grace stood in silence, arms crossed, watching him, but there was something in her stance, a willingness to listen. "It's a start, Daniel," she replied, her tone softer than before. "But admitting mistakes isn't enough. What are you planning to do about it?" Daniel took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the weight of her question. He'd considered it, but he didn't yet have all the answers. "I don't know, Grace," he admitted, "but I can't keep going down the same path." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's right. Real change is something you have to work on every single day. Learning to listen and understand that leadership isn't about always holding the reins. It's about serving others. Can you still commit to that?" Daniel gulped. "Yes, I'm willing, but I don't know if I can manage it by myself." Grace offered a slight smile, as if she saw a glimpse of possibility. "No one can, Daniel," she replied. "That's why real leadership thrives on partnership. You have to be able to rely on others. You need to understand you can't carry it all solo." Her words reverberated in his mind. Daniel realized he had spent years attempting to control every detail, believing that trusting others would only weaken him. But now, facing his own limitations, he began to wonder if perhaps trust was the missing piece in his leadership approach. After a quiet moment, Grace continued, "If you genuinely want to transform, there's a path forward, but it won't be easy. It's going to require you to let go of everything you think you know about leadership." Daniel looked up, sensing a real glimmer of hope. "I'm ready. Whatever it takes, show me how I can make a difference." Later that week, Grace took Daniel to his first outreach project under the company's new community initiative. The program was focused on helping women in tough situations build skills and find work. For Daniel, accustomed to the comfort and formality of the corporate world, the grassroots setting felt starkly different. During one session with the women involved, he found himself surrounded by people he never imagined he'd sit beside. Single mothers, survivors of abusive relationships, and others striving to keep their families afloat. As he listened to each story, Daniel felt the weight of every word. This wasn't about revenue or spreadsheets. It was about people, about lives where every dollar and each opportunity mattered. As the session wrapped up, an elderly woman approached him. "You're Mr. Daniel Carter, right? The one whose company is funding this program?" she asked, her voice steady. Daniel, feeling a bit uneasy, nodded. "Yes, that's me." She looked at him for a lingering moment. "My son worked for your company years ago. He was let go without notice after years of loyalty. It crushed him. He lost his drive, you know." Daniel felt a pang in his chest, a mix of regret and shame. "I'm sorry," she said, shaking her head slowly. "Maybe you never took the time to understand. But seeing you here today, I think something might be different. I hope this change is real," she added, leaving Daniel feeling vulnerable and exposed. Her words struck him as an undeniable truth, one that made him confront his past actions. For years, he'd caused pain without ever realizing it. He was exactly the type of businessman Grace had described, someone blind to the true worth of people. Back at the office, still processing what he'd experienced, Daniel sought out Grace and thanked her for bringing him to the project. "I really get it now, Grace," he said, with genuine appreciation. Grace looked at him, her gaze softened with understanding rather than her usual coolness. "This is just the beginning, Daniel. Change requires time and effort. But as you keep at it, you'll start to realize that true leadership is about serving others." That same week, Grace encouraged him to attend a meeting with the team working on the project. It was a chance for him to hear out their concerns and ideas, something he'd rarely taken time for before. Walking into the room, Daniel felt the weight of their eyes on him. Some looked wary, others hopeful. He knew he had to earn their trust back, and fast. Grace nudged him to say something, but he paused, realizing that listening might be the best first step. The meeting started with each team member sharing their thoughts on the project's direction. Michael, an idealistic and committed young team member, spoke up about the struggles they faced due to limited resources and the demand for quick results. "We need steadiness, Daniel," Michael said, his tone respectful but resolute. "This project isn't some short-term investment. The people we're helping depend on us, and that takes patience and dedication." Daniel listened intently, feeling the weight of his past decisions. He understood that Michael, like Grace, cared deeply about the project's success, but wanted it built on a foundation of long-term support. For the first time, Daniel found himself wanting to understand their perspectives rather than pushing his own. After the meeting, he resolved to become more involved in the project, not as a leader, but as someone willing to learn. He wanted to see the real-world impact of his decisions. Grace joined him on visits to some of the communities they supported. During one visit, he met Julia, a young mother who'd found new hope through a training program that allowed her to secure a job and support her daughter. She spoke with heartfelt gratitude about how the project had transformed her life. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest as he listened, realizing that her story was a powerful reminder. He wasn't just managing numbers on a screen, but working with real lives, people who had stories, struggles, and hopes. This was more than just a project or another step on his career ladder. Seeing the meaningful change Grace had championed opened his eyes. He now understood that the true measure of success wasn't in statistics, but in the lives transformed by the project. Back at the office, he approached Grace with a new sense of gravity and resolve. "You were right, Grace. I treated this as a tool, something to polish my image and propel me forward. But today, I saw just how misguided I was." Grace watched him, taking in his words carefully. "So, what do you intend to do about it?" He paused, choosing his words with purpose. "I want to change. I want to do this the right way, to serve and witness the genuine impact of our work. I want everyone touched by this project to experience something I've never truly known, authentic leadership." Grace nodded, recognizing a spark of sincerity. "Then start proving it. In every decision, every interaction, show us you're serious, not just in words, but in action." Over the following weeks, Daniel remained deeply engaged, actively participating in every initiative, shadowing team members, and learning from their hands-on efforts. Gradually, his role evolved. He was no longer the commanding figure issuing directives. Instead, he became someone open to listening, understanding, and serving. The board, initially skeptical, began to notice these subtle changes in his demeanor. He was more open to feedback and less quick to react. Grace also noticed his growth, though she stayed cautiously observant, aware that real change took time and perseverance. By the month's end, Daniel sensed a newfound peace in his work. For the first time, he viewed the project not as a means to an end for his own advancement, but as a mission with a purpose that impacted countless lives. When Grace happened to walk by his office, he stood up and offered his gratitude. "Thank you, Grace, for not giving up on me, even when it seemed like I'd never get it." She gave a slight smile. "Leadership is a journey, Daniel. But if you're committed, I believe you'll find what it's truly about." With this fresh outlook, Daniel felt truly prepared for a path of meaningful and impactful leadership. He threw himself into the project with a dedication that astonished those around him. In the weeks after the crisis, he made it his mission to master every aspect of the work, from weekly community check-ins to scrutinizing financial reports down to the last detail. Rather than treating the project as just another investment, Daniel began to see it as a purpose-driven mission. This was his chance to rebuild not only the confidence of the board and his team, but also his own sense of integrity. Board members started to notice this change. Grace was one of the first to recognize how invested Daniel had become. Initially, she observed from a distance, wondering if his new approach would hold. But as time passed, Daniel's unwavering presence, his genuine questions, and his willingness to listen and learn demonstrated his deep commitment. As his resolve became clear, the board's respect and confidence in him grew as well. At first, Daniel attended project meetings out of obligation, but before long, these gatherings became a core part of his schedule. He began learning people's names, understanding their struggles, and celebrating their achievements. It was a stark shift from the luxurious offices and high-profile meetings that once filled his days. During one visit, he had a heartfelt conversation with Ashley, a middle-aged woman who had recently lost her job and found a new beginning within the project. Ashley shared with raw honesty the challenges she'd faced and how the initiative helped her reclaim her dignity. "It's more than a job for me, Mr. Daniel," Ashley said, her eyes brimming with emotion. "It's a new life. For the first time, I feel like someone believes in my potential." Daniel felt a tightness in his throat. He wasn't simply aiding one individual, he was transforming lives. Each story he heard was a powerful reminder of the difference he could make, fueling his commitment even further. He wanted to live up to the trust these people had in the project, and more importantly, prove that he genuinely cared. The project was no longer just a plan on paper. It had become real. The positive outcomes started to emerge, and with them, the company's reputation soared. The board members, who once questioned Daniel's capacity to lead effectively, now appeared to express approval. In meetings, Daniel kept his demeanor calm and direct, steering clear of the flamboyant style that used to define him. He shared the project results with a grounded approach, giving credit to the team and emphasizing Grace's critical contributions. Each statistic served as undeniable evidence that the project was creating real impact, and the board members didn't mask their satisfaction. Mr. Lindsay, the board's chairman, remicled during one of the meetings, "Daniel, I see you're approaching this project with a level of seriousness many of us hadn't anticipated. This pilot program is a triumph, and I believe we can expand it in a way that's sustainable." Daniel allowed himself a quiet smile, feeling the weight of their approval. He was fully aware that Grace had been an irreplaceable guide in this journey, and he never missed a chance to recognize her in each meeting. What had once been simple professional respect was beginning to evolve into something more personal. As they spent more time together, Daniel started seeing Grace in a new light. She wasn't just a remiclable leader. She was a courageous, sincere woman who was truly committed to her work. He noticed it in the way she spoke to every individual involved in the project, the care she took with each detail, and the respect she extended to all. Grace was a quiet force that naturally commanded trust and respect. Daniel and Grace went to a gathering that project participants organized one day while they were in the neighborhood. The locals had prepared a modest celebration to show their gratitude to the team. When they arrived, Daniel watched Grace interact with people, her kindness evident in a way that moved him profoundly. Everyone present responded warmly to the warmth she exuded, and she fit right in. She really gets these people, Daniel thought with admiration. Grace didn't merely oversee the project, she was fully immersed in it, and everyone felt that connection. When the celebration wrapped up, Daniel offered to walk Grace back to the office. As they strolled through the peaceful community streets, he felt a growing urge to understand her better. Grace was a bit of a mystery, and he wanted to uncover what drove her passion for their work. "Grace," he began in a gentler voice, "I've always been struck by your dedication to this project." "What made you get so deeply involved?" Daniel asked. Grace's face brightened with a sincere smile. "Daniel, I think I've always felt a calling to make a difference. When I was younger, I saw people close to me struggling, and it left a lasting impact on me. Helping others rebuild is, for me, the most fulfilling way to give my life purpose." Her words reached Daniel in an unexpected way. He'd never considered their work through that lens. To him, it was about reputation and legacy. But for Grace, it was deeply personal, a mission close to her heart. And from that moment, he began to see the depth behind the remiclable woman beside him. In the following weeks, Daniel and Grace grew even closer. What had once been a formal and guarded partnership turned relaxed, filled with mutual respect and admiration. They brainstormed strategies, swapped ideas, and stood by each other in every decision. Yet Daniel began to sense something different stirring within him. His feelings toward Grace were shifting from admiration to something far deeper. This realization took him by surprise. Daniel, who had always maintained a careful distance from romantic feelings in the workplace, now found himself thinking about Grace constantly, eager to be near her and see her smile. She brought a calm but energizing presence, someone who motivated him to grow and to press forward. One evening, after a long meeting, they lingered in the office, talking about the future of the project. What started as a professional discussion turned personal, and Daniel took the opportunity to share his gratitude. "Grace, "I owe you so much for what I've learned these past months," he said earnestly. "Before, I thought success was all about control and expansion. But you've shown me that the real value lies in creating something meaningful." Grace turned to face him, clearly moved by his words. "It means so much to know that, Daniel. Seeing this growth in you has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. Daniel felt an impulse to move closer, but held back, aware of the professional boundary they shared. Yet, he knew that what he felt for Grace was genuine and real. As time went on, Daniel felt increasingly captivated by Grace. He began noticing all the small things, her smile when something touched her heart, the way she inspired those around her, and the dedication she had for their project. Grace was different, someone who added a layer of meaning to his life that he hadn't known before. One evening, after hours at the office while they were going over some final reports, Daniel, almost without realizing it, blurted out, "You know, you're one of the most incredible people I've ever met, right?" The sincerity in his voice clearly surprised Grace, who gave a soft laugh. "Thank you, Daniel," she replied, "but I think you've changed too, and you've become someone worth admiring." Her words echoed in his heart, and he realized he was genuinely in love. This wasn't just another passing attraction. It was a deep respect and a shared vision with Grace, a desire to build something meaningful alongside her. As he walked home that night, Daniel felt a profound shift. Grace had not only changed his work life, but had touched his heart in a way that made everything feel different. From that moment, he knew that regardless of what lay ahead, his life was forever altered. The days went by, and Daniel and Grace grew closer. Their professional partnership began evolving into a deeper connection, a closeness that grew with every encounter. Daniel, once driven purely by ambition, now felt himself opening up to moments of honesty and vulnerability with Grace. He felt lighter, more alive, and for the first time, truly whole. Grace, too, saw these changes in Daniel. Spending time with him, she noticed how much he'd grown into someone genuinely admirable. His transformation wasn't a show, it was real, and that drew her to him in a way she hadn't expected. She admired his commitment to creating something significant, and slowly, her heart began to open to him as well. In the weeks that followed, Daniel looked for little opportunities to be close to Grace. He'd invite her for lunch after meetings. Daniel felt a rush of tenderness and longing he couldn't ignore. The gentle warmth between them was almost palpable, and he found himself stealing glances at Grace, each one pulling him deeper into his feelings. Breaking the quiet that had settled over them, he cleared his throat and spoke up, his voice low and sincere. They sat side by side, close enough that their arms brushed against each other, and Daniel felt a rush of tenderness and longing he couldn't ignore. The gentle warmth between them was almost palpable, and he found himself stealing glances at Grace, each one pulling him deeper into his feelings. Breaking the quiet that had settled over them, he cleared his throat and spoke up, his voice low and sincere. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, surprising even himself with the weight of his words. "For everything. For teaching me, for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself, even when I didn't deserve it." Grace looked at him, her expression softening as she listened to the gratitude in his voice. For a moment, she seemed taken aback, as if she hadn't realized how much she'd truly impacted him, but then her face relaxed into a gentle smile. "You don't need to thank me, Daniel," she replied, her tone calm and understanding. "The change came from you. I just helped you find your own way." Daniel smiled back, but there was more he had to say, something he could no longer keep bottled up. His heart was pounding, each beat urging him forward, giving him the courage to finally express what he'd been holding on to for so long. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before he began. "Grace," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his words laced with vulnerability. "I can't keep hiding how I feel. The truth is, I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with emotion, and for a few seconds, time seemed to stand still as Grace processed what he'd just said. Daniel's heart raced, his mind filled with a mix of hope and fear, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake by speaking his truth. But instead of withdrawing, Grace's face softened even more, her eyes shining with a warmth that gave him all the reassurance he needed. "I'm in love with you too, Daniel," she confessed, her voice full of a quiet, unwavering honesty. "I've been feeling this way for a while now, but I was afraid of what it might mean for us, for everything we've built together." A relieved, emotional laugh escaped from Daniel, breaking the tension that had gripped him. "I've felt the same way," he admitted, his voice tinged with relief. "But I can't pretend anymore. I don't just want us to be colleagues or friends. I want something real with you, something more." Grace's eyes met his, and she gave a small nod, her smile full of hope and understanding. "I want that too," she whispered, her words barely audible. "I think we're finally ready for this. For something that's truly ours." They sat there, caught in each other's gaze, leaning in as they closed the small distance between them. Daniel's heart nearly stopped as their lips met in a soft, lingering kiss, full of the emotion they had both kept hidden. In that instant, every wall they'd built, every doubt, every fear, melted away, leaving only the raw, undeniable connection they shared. After the kiss, they pulled back slightly, exchanging a look that said everything words couldn't. Daniel wrapped his arms around her in a tender embrace, a silent promise of what lay ahead for them. From that day forward, their relationship blossomed naturally, each moment bringing them closer together. They spent time outside of work, exploring the city, sharing dinners, and enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. Every shared experience deepened their bond, allowing them to see new sides of each other that made their connection even stronger. At work, they remained professional and focused, though anyone observing them could sense a new light in their eyes, a bond that had grown undeniable. Together, Grace and Daniel made it clear that their commitment to the project would never waver, despite the love they had found in one another. The bond between them was undeniable, and it fueled their shared dedication to making the project succeed. Over the months, they watched as their hard work transformed the community. The project achieved remarkable success, opening doors for people who once struggled to find employment or personal growth. What had once seemed impossible was now a reality for many. As the project expanded into neighboring areas, the company's reputation grew. It became known for its positive, sustainable impact, and the board finally recognized the value Daniel brought to the table. They fully reinstated him in his leadership role, a decision even Mr. Lindsay, one of his toughest critics, openly supported. In a meeting, Mr. Lindsay commended Daniel, a rare act for him. "Daniel, you've proven that change is possible. This project's success is a testament to your commitment and vision. I'm proud to say you've truly become a leader." Daniel accepted the praise humbly, reflecting on how long and challenging the journey had been. He glanced at Grace, who sat beside him, and his heart swelled with gratitude. He knew she had been his anchor through it all, a constant source of strength that made every hardship bearable. Their relationship outside of work continued to deepen. They were truly happy together, and Daniel realized he wanted to build a future with Grace.
"Will, are you still lingering here?" Mrs. Lewis inquired, her eyes filled with genuine concern. "Don't you have some responsibilities or duties to attend to?" "Actually, Not at this moment, Mrs. Lewis, replied Will, his tone underpinned by a slight plea. You see, they haven't admitted any severe cases today, so I've wrapped all of my assigned tasks. If you don't mind, may I stay here a little longer? I hope you don't feel the need to send me away. Remember, I'm using this time to prepare myself for my forthcoming educational journey." Mrs. Lewis, a seasoned nurse, let out a weary sigh. "Interesting. I wasn't under the impression you were particularly invested in such pursuits," she countered. "At a glance, it seems like you're merely idling away your time here, not doing anything productive. Wouldn't it be better to dive into your textbooks?" "Mrs. Lewis, my time here isn't wasted," Will responded earnestly. "I may not be actively working, but I'm soaking up invaluable hands-on experience." Mrs. Lewis responded with a disheartened shake of her head, fully understanding the subtext of Will's statement about gaining experience. Olivia was the experience Will was seeking, not the professional kind, but rather a romantic interest. She was the reason behind his frequent, lingering visits to this particular department. Olivia was an undeniable beauty, possessing an allure that was hard to ignore. However, her beauty was offset by an air of arrogance that clung to her like a second skin. Her personality was akin to that of a serpent, slick and potentially treacherous. There he stood, Will, a fully grown man, smitten by the enchanting but aloof Olivia. It could be argued that his infatuation was a personal matter, one in which others had no right to interfere. Yet Mrs. Lewis couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for him. He was a good young man, compassionate, always ready to lend a helping hand. However, Mrs. Lewis harbored a firm conviction, a gut feeling born from years of observing human behavior. She was certain that Olivia would never return Will's affectionate sentiments. She understood the likely heartbreak that awaited Will, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. Will, a former soldier, had chosen to transition into the medical field after his military service. The aspiration to become a healthcare professional had been nestled in his heart for quite a while. The timing had not been right until now. It seemed he was finally preparing for the journey. When he first dived into the world of medicine, he wasn't enticed by the prospect of a hefty paycheck. Rather, he was intrigued by the inner workings of nursing, the direct impact on patients' lives that the profession promised. Mrs. Lewis was confident that Will would excel as a medical professional. Not only did he possess an impressive intellect, but he also showed genuine interest in patients' experiences, consistently demonstrating a heartfelt desire to help them. What stood out about Will was his palpable enthusiasm to be a doctor. This ambition was so apparent that Mrs. Lewis couldn't help but notice it. She knew his dreams could indeed become a reality, provided Olivia didn't shatter his resilience. Fortunately, that day, Olivia was off duty. It was Dakota's shift instead, which would commence later in the evening. Dakota was a charming and humble girl, hailing from a rural farming community. Her family was comprised of hard-working farmers, and her upbringing was a reflection of their humble and diligent lifestyle. Dakota was a generous individual, always willing to lend a helping hand to those in need. It was a trait ingrained in her through her upbringing. While Olivia performed her duties as per her job description, like administering injections or measuring patients' blood pressures, Dakota went above and beyond. She was known to assist the janitorial staff in moving equipment through the corridors or to help change bad linens in the wards whenever she had spare time. Dakota's actions illustrated her innate kindness and her commitment to the well-being of the hospital community. That evening, as Dakota was beginning her shift, the department phone trilled into life. She picked it up, listening attentively to the caller. After a moment, she asked the person on the other end to hold on and turned to Will. "They've brought in an elderly woman. They need some assistance. Could you go down?" she asked. With a swift nod, Will rushed down to reception. The old woman lay unconscious on a gurney, her frail form inspiring a deep sadness in Will's eyes. "What happened?" Will questioned the paramedic. "Was it a car accident?" "No," replied the paramedic, shaking his head. "She was found at her home. The specifics are unclear at the moment. Her neighbors discovered her on the staircase." Will's gaze returned to the elderly woman, concern etched on his face. "She's in pretty rough shape," he observed quietly. "Considering her age, it's uncertain if she'll pull through." The medical team transported the woman to the intensive care unit. Will was frequently present by her side, providing whatever assistance he could. In time, the attending physician, Dr. Andrews, started examining her scans. "Hey, intern," he called out to Will. "Take a look at these. You might learn something." Will scrutinized the scans for an extended period, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary to his untrained eye. He handed the scans back, admitting, "I'm not sure if I'm supposed to spot anything specific, but I don't see anything unusual." "That's okay. It's common when you're just starting," Dr. Andrews reassured him. "But you're correct. There's nothing amiss in these scans. However, her body does show signs of extensive bruising." Will looked at the doctor, his surprise evident. "So, what does that imply?" "Why don't you mull over it during your shift?" Dr. Andrews suggested, a small smile playing on his lips. "In the morning, we'll discuss our respective findings." Will nodded his understanding. Dr. Andrews often challenged them with problems to solve, a task he usually managed well. This was another such puzzle, and as he paced in the wake of the doctor, he turned over every word in his mind. The answers seemed just beyond his reach. Dr. Andrews frequently advised, "Knowing the cause of the disease is the key to curing it. It's essential to eliminate the cause." While Will didn't fully subscribe to this notion, he acknowledged there was a kernel of truth in it. Turning to Dakota, Dr. Andrews instructed, "Ensure you monitor her blood pressure hourly. Administer painkillers as necessary. That's her course of action for now." "Understood, Dr. Andrews. So, what's her story?" Dakota inquired. Dr. Andrews glanced at Will, replying, "We'll hear Will's take on it in the morning." Dakota smiled, looking at Will. "Giving him some training, huh?" "Indeed," Dr. Andrews replied, grinning back at Will. "Unless, of course, he's not interested in becoming a real doctor." Will devoted the entire night to scouring the internet for any insights that could help him solve this medical puzzle. Occasionally, he would return to the old woman's bedside, observing her condition closely. He noticed the emergence of tiny crimson-blue marks scattered across her body, which he recognized as bruises. Dr. Andrews had been correct in his assessment. The patterns of bruising were inconsistent with a simple fall. For these marks to appear as they did, the woman would have had to tumble down the stairs multiple times and in a variety of ways. Lost in a sea of hypotheses, Will struggled to find a plausible explanation. However, as often happens with elusive answers, the solution dawned on him while he was deep in slumber. As morning drew near, a weary Will found himself succumbing to sleep on the couch. In his dreams, he revisited a terrifying memory from his childhood. He saw his younger self, barely 6 or 7 years old, seated on the living room sofa. His mother busied herself in the kitchen while his father was at work. Will eagerly waited his father's return, anticipating an evening lesson in the enchanting game of chess. During this time, Will's family resided in a small, tight-knit town, a place where everyone was familiar with everyone else. The locals could even identify their neighbors' dogs at a glance. The sense of community was strong, and the low crime rate meant that people rarely felt the need to lock their doors. When the front door slammed shut, Will's mother flashed a knowing smile from the kitchen, announcing, "Here comes Daddy." But as she turned to greet her husband, her smile faded into a look of sheer disbelief. Her voice trembled as she stammered, "What are you doing here?" A stranger stood in the doorway, his face twisted into a malicious grin. Young Will instinctively recoiled, feeling an ominous aura emanating from the man. The stranger sneered. "Can't even muster a polite good evening, huh? Weren't expecting me, were you, wifey?" "I'm not your wife. I haven't been for 5 years." "Why are you here?" she responded, her voice trembling but defiant. "Easy there, wifey." "Stop that. Stop calling me that. I'm not your wifey." "That was your decision, wasn't it? Have you ever stopped to think if I had a say in it too? Probably not." Simon held her gaze, allowing a tense silence to fill the room. "Nobody bothered to ask me. Nobody cared about my feelings. Would you like to hear my opinion?" His voice rose in pitch, seething with resentment. "I disagree with your decision. I don't think it's fair for a man to clean grimy prison floors while his wife flits about enjoying life with someone else." A sly grin spread across Simon's face, quickly morphing into a scowl. "Simon, you need to leave," Catherine implored, concern etched into her features. "You're scaring Will." "That's my son. Simon countered, his tone chillingly nonchalant. He should get used to my rules. Catherine was growing increasingly impatient. Sensing the escalating tension, her voice rose as she retorted, "He's not going to adjust to anything. He has a father already, and I have a husband." Taking a deep breath, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes filled with desperation. "Please, Simon," she pleaded softly. "Please leave." Simon remained silent, seeming to contemplate her plea. He raised his eyebrows in a silent response, as if to say, "Well, looks like you've chosen the hard way." He laid his hand on the wall, stepping further into the room. He took in the surroundings, his eyes skimming over the photographs lining the walls. He meandered towards them, pausing to examine a picture of Catherine's new husband. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, erupting into a small chuckle. Continuing his slow exploration, he casually picked up various items, only to set them back in place. As he drifted past Catherine, she watched him warily from the corners of her eyes. Her breaths were heavy and quick, her anxiety evident in each exhale. "Get out," she seethed through clenched teeth. No sooner had the words left her mouth than a harsh blow struck her cheek. The next moment, Simon's fists were raining down on her. When she crumbled to the floor, he continued his assault, his feet now the weapons of choice. Will sprang into action, rushing to his mother's defense. With a shrill scream, he lunged at Simon, sinking his teeth into the man's hand with all the might his small frame could muster. Caught off guard, Simon yanked his hand away with such force that Will was flung across the room. His small body collided with the wall, and the impact knocked him unconscious instantly. The subsequent events would only become known to Will later. The man he knew as his father, Jim, burst into the room from outside. He snatched up the baseball bat that was propped against the wall by the entrance and hurled himself at Simon. The brutal altercation ended as quickly as it had begun. The sight of his wife in distress and his unconscious son in the corner fueled Jim's rage. In a blind fit of emotion, he did what everyone might have done in such a frenzied state. The court sentenced Jim to prison for manslaughter. The initial year in confinement took a significant toll on his mental health. He fell ill with pneumonia, a condition from which he would never recover, despite the doctor's efforts. Catherine spent a lengthy period in the hospital, her injuries eerily similar to those of the elderly woman now under Will's care in the ICU. Will awoke from his sleep, drenched in sweat. Their recurring dream always culminated in the same traumatic scene of him colliding with the wall and slipping into unconsciousness. When Will was of an age to comprehend the implications, Catherine narrated the disturbing events of that fateful day. Before their marriage, Simon had seemed perfect in every way. He had been charming and generous during their courtship, which led her to believe they could build a beautiful life together. However, after they wed, their seemingly idyllic family life turned into a living nightmare for Catherine. Simon's behavior began to change drastically. He was carelessly extravagant, squandering money despite lacking a stable job, yet he always seemed to have what he wanted. After Will's birth, Catherine started suspecting that Simon was involved in some sort of illicit activities, possibly linked to the local gang. Numerous times she urged him to abandon his murky dealings and lead a law-abiding life. When her pleas fell on deaf ears, she beseeched him to reconsider for the sake of their son. His smirking response was etched vividly in her memory. "Are you suggesting I should become a factory worker like you and your pathetic father?" "Why not? At least then Will wouldn't have to feel ashamed of his father in the future." For the first time in her life, she was subjected to physical abuse that day. In response, Catherine immediately left Simon. The very next day, he was apprehended for robbery and sent to jail. Naturally, Will retained no memories of his biological father. Catherine filed for divorce shortly thereafter. A year later, she married again, this time to a man who genuinely cared for her and her son. Jim was a kind-hearted individual who treated Will as if he were his own. In Will's mind, Jim was his true father. In the present day, Catherine continued to work at the factory, notorious for its harmful emissions. Will stared ahead, deep in thought. The elderly woman in the ICU was over 70 years old. Who could be so heartless as to harm such a frail person? Despite his attempts, he struggled to connect the dots, unable to draw a definitive conclusion. he began to doubt the validity of his hypothesis. As it neared the time for Dr. Andrews to arrive, Will completed his duties for the shift. Noticing Dr. Andrews at his usual spot, Will realized that the doctor had already visited the elderly patient. "Dakota, could you fetch the test results, please? If everything's in order, we'll transfer her to a regular ward." "On it, Dr. Andrews." As Dr. Andrews turned, he spotted Will approaching. Here comes our future doctor. So, what have you deduced?" Will met the doctor's gaze with a solemn expression. "I've got a theory, but I'm not sure it's something you'll find particularly impressive." As Will began to lay out his findings, Olivia arrived to switch shifts with Dakota. He was so engrossed in his discussion with Dr. Andrews that he didn't notice her entrance. "I'm all ears, Will. Your time to shine. Go ahead." Glancing at his notes, Will began to explain. "Well, you see, Dr. Andrews, everything suggests that she was the victim of physical assault. What I don't understand is why the neighbors didn't report it in that case. And I'm stuck trying to figure out who could beat her up like that." Dr. Andrews sighed. "Well, I'm not surprised. Not by you, but with your conclusion. Part of our job is to assist the police in answering exactly those kind of questions." Overhearing the conversation, Olivia smirked and interjected. "Come on, you guys. You don't need to be a detective to figure out what happened. Look at her. Another drunkard who probably brawled over a bottle of whiskey with her husband or something." Dakota nudged her lightly in the side, but it did little to temper Olivia's words. If anything, she grew louder. "Am I wrong? These people drink like fish and fight, and we end up wasting our time trying to save them. We shouldn't bother. Society would be cleaner without them." Dr. Andrews turned towards her with a stern gaze. "Olivia, I sincerely hope you never fall ill. And if you do, I hope you'll be fortunate enough to have people around you who will care for you." With that, Dr. Andrews turned and left the room. Olivia then shifted her attention to Will, batting her eyelashes playfully. She was aware of Will's feelings for her and often used this to get him to do her bidding. But her next request and the dismissive way she made it gave Will a pause. "Will, can you get me a cup of coffee?" For a moment, Will's mind was elsewhere, pondering over something completely different. Olivia's request didn't seem out of place to him initially, but when he snapped back to reality, he realized the way she had asked was deeply inappropriate. Her complete disregard for the elderly woman's plight was shocking and made him reconsider his feelings for her. As he uttered the words, he felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He no longer had the obligation to please Olivia in the hopes of winning her over. "No," she shook his head. "You can get your own coffee. You have 2 working legs." Dakota, who was in the process of filling out a report sheet, struggled to hide a grin. The surprised expression on Olivia's face was priceless. The next day, Will's first order of business was to visit the ward where Mrs. Owen had been transferred. On entering, he asked about her condition. She responded that she was feeling much better thanks to the painkillers. "Well, I'm glad you're feeling better, ma'am. If you need anything, don't hesitate to let me know." Just as Will was about to leave the ward, Mrs. Owen called out to him. She took a deep breath before speaking, clearly struggling with her decision to ask him for help. "Excuse me, Will. I know this might sound strange, but I don't know who else to turn to. I can't reach my house. It's probably locked. I need some things. Do you think you could bring them to me? I can give you some money." "Of course, Mrs. Owen. What do you need?" "Oh, it's not much at all. Just a few items from the store and some fruit." That evening, Will told his mother about the old lady. Catherine packed a few items for Mrs. Owen. She was so worried for the elderly woman that her blood pressure shot up. For her, the thought of being alone and helpless was terrifying. The next day, Mrs. Owen was visibly surprised as Will unpacked the items his mother had sent. "Will, you didn't take the cash last night. Did you pay for these things yourself?" "Mrs. Owen, my mother is an elderly woman like you, and when I told her about you, she was concerned. These are the things she wanted to give to you." "Your mother is such a kind-hearted woman. Thank you both so much. But this is too much. I don't understand why you're being so kind to me." "Don't worry about that. The important thing is that you eat well and stay healthy." "Thank you so much. Could I please repay you?" "That's not necessary, Mrs. Owen. It's not a problem at all. Now, please get some rest. We're going to look for your relatives. You do have relatives, right?" "Yes, I do have a son." Mrs. Owen confessed, a glimmer of sadness crossing her frail features. Will couldn't help but wonder why the son had not yet arrived to check on his ailing mother. "He must be worried about you. We'll contact him, and I'm sure he'll be here soon. For now, you just focus on getting your strength back," reassured Will, turning to leave the room. Suddenly, Mrs. Owen's feeble hand latched onto his arm, a sense of urgency in her eyes. "Will, could you do me a favor? Could you tell my son that I won't survive, or that I'm already dead? I'd do anything to keep him away," she pleaded, her voice trembling. Shocked at her words, Will turned to face her. "Was it your son? Did he hurt you?" he inquired, a sinking feeling in his stomach. Tears welled up in Mrs. Owen's eyes as she quickly shook her head. No, it wasn't him. It was my fault. But please, tell him I'm no more." Will was left reeling from her words. He couldn't wrap his head around it. Why would a son hurt his own mother like that? He thought about his own mom and felt a chill run down his spine. The very idea seemed grotesque to him. Shaken, he paced down the corridor, shaking his head in an attempt to banish the distressing thoughts. At that moment, Mrs. Lewis, another nurse, approached him. "Will, are you all right? Why are you shaking your head like that? Also, the old woman has some visitors. Seems like it's her son. He doesn't seem too friendly if you ask me," she shared. Will's heart pounded at her words. He's the one who did this to her. He needs to be kept away from her. Mrs. Lewis looked at him in shock. Her son? Her own flesh and blood? Will, are you absolutely sure? "Yes, Mrs. Lewis. Unfortunately, it's true. Where is he? I need to confront him." Will rushed towards the reception, with Mrs. Lewis trailing behind him, cautioning him not to make any rash decisions. Ignoring her, Will entered the reception and saw a scruffy man arguing heatedly with Dakota. "Then when are visiting hours? I need to see my mother now. She's got all my cards. Do you expect me to starve?" Dakota looked utterly confused. "So your mother handles all your cards?" "That's none of your business. You ask too many questions." Will overheard their exchange and hastily retreated to Mrs. Owen's room to inform her about her son's arrival, mentioning the credit cards. Mrs. Owen's son, John, had been living with her for the past few years following his divorce. He had a rocky history, having been in and out of jail for offenses like drunk driving or even minor shoplifting. Jobless, he relied on his mother's pension to scrape by. Mrs. Owen, a retiree, found solace and joy in tending to her garden. She tried to persuade John to secure a job and take responsibility for his life. Initially, her attempts were gentle and patient, but John continually returned to his mother was pleased for more money. He gradually started exploiting her credit cards and soon made it a regular practice. Mrs. Owen lived a humble, frugal lifestyle, not really spending much of her pension. John, however, managed to convince his mother to let him handle her finances, promising to invest wisely in stocks. Initially hesitant, Mrs. Owen agreed to the proposal under the condition that John would attend rehab and give up his bad habits. John complied, but unbeknownst to Mrs. Owen, he left the rehab center within a week. A month later, John phoned his mother claiming steady improvement and even spoke of investing as a hobby. Believing her son, Mrs. Owen felt a rush of hope and joy. When John returned home from rehab, he was clean, well-dressed, and trustworthy in appearance. It was all a facade to regain his mother's trust. As soon as he gained access to her cards again, he fell back into his destructive habits. The following months was filled with endless arguments and fights between the mother and son. Things escalated the day Mrs. Owen decided to revoke John's access to her cards. John arrived home drunk one day and demanded the cards. When Mrs. Owen refused, he violently assaulted her, pushing her down the stairs, and fled. Yet, even after such a horrifying incident, Mrs. Owen felt compelled to protect her son. She didn't want to involve the police, afraid of seeing her son behind bars. The situation overwhelmed her, and she yearned for a safe escape. She believed that if she could disappear, John would have no choice but to become independent. Will listened to Mrs. Owen's heartbreaking account and left her room, a burning rage simmering within him. He strode towards the reception, where he saw John arguing heatedly with Dakota. Without a second thought, Will stormed in and grabbed John by the collar. "You heartless beast! How could you harm your own mother?" Will raged, lifting John off the ground by his collar. "Who on earth are you?" John spotted his feet kicking the air. With a grunt, Will slammed him against the wall. "Who am I? You're about to find out." From behind he heard Mrs. Lewis scream in alarm. "Will, don't! Let him be. He's not worth it." Despite his righteous fury, Will knew he couldn't allow himself to be pulled into a violent confrontation. He could end up facing legal repercussions. With a final snarl, he heaved John towards the exit. "If you dare to show your face around Mrs. Owen again, you'll regret it." John scrambled up and darted out of the hospital, but not before screaming back, "You'll pay for this! You all will!" Drained and shaken, Will sank to the floor, his chest heaving with sobs. His own painful past had been stirred up by the incident. Memories of his mother, also a victim of abuse. Every time he witnessed violence against the weak, the traumatic images from his childhood haunted him. The police arrived at the hospital within an hour. Mrs. Lewis and Dakota earnestly explained how John had threatened to harm Mrs. Owen further if she didn't give in to his demands. They informed the police about the argument John had with the nurse who denied him access to the ward, and about the harsh words he had directed towards her. They maintained that Will hadn't hit John and had merely escorted him out forcefully. Meanwhile, Dr. Andrews prepared a detailed injury report of Mrs. Owen and handed it to the police. "Here's the evidence of physical abuse that this elderly lady endured at the hands of her own son. She intends to press charges." At Will's urging, Mrs. Owen had agreed to file a lawsuit against John. Will had told her that it didn't matter if the offender was her son. Justice was paramount, and everyone must face the consequences of their actions. One of the officers perused the injury report, his eyebrows climbing higher with each line he read. "So, all of these injuries were inflicted by that man?" "Indeed." After taking statements and collecting the necessary information, the police left, promising to apprehend John. They assured everyone that the investigation would follow due process, and if the evidence stacked up, John could face at least a dozen years in prison. 2 weeks after the harrowing incident, it was time for Mrs. Owen's discharge from the hospital. Will awaited her in the hallway. "Will, your mom's here. Have you seen her yet?" Dakota asked, her voice filled with enthusiasm. Will returned her question with a warm smile. "Yeah, she's here for me too. She wanted to see Mrs. Owen." As Mrs. Owen was being wheeled out of her ward, a look of concern etched her face. The sight didn't escape the notice of those present. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Owen?" Dakota asked, bestowing a warm smile upon the elderly woman. "I'm feeling great. Thank you so much for asking," Mrs. Owen replied, managing a small smile of her own. Olivia lingered nearby, a forced smirk playing on her lips. Despite the outward show of indifference, a churning discomfort gnawed at her from within for her previous ill-spoken words about Mrs. Owen. However, she put on a brave face, doing her utmost to conceal her internal conflict. Mrs. Owen felt isolated and vulnerable, devoid of any immediate support. She was well aware that her choices were limited. Either employ a caregiver to assist her until she regained her strength, or muster the courage to brave the hardships on her own. Panic, like a creeping shadow, slowly began to envelop Mrs. Owen as she grappled with the harsh realities of her situation. Her heart pounded in her chest like a sledgehammer, matching the rhythm of her escalating fear. Each breath she took was shakier than the last, as she desperately tried to maintain her composure. The bustling hospital hallway seemed to shrink around her. The murmur of conversations and the clatter of medical equipment felt distant and hollow, as her own thoughts drowned out the world around her. It was then that her eyes fell upon Will, his warm smile offering a beacon of hope amidst her brewing storm of fear. Her heart steadied a little. At that moment, an elderly woman carrying a vibrant bouquet of flowers approached her, a warm smile illuminating her face. "Hello, Carol. I'm Catherine, Will's mother. I've heard that you have quite the green thumb. I could really use some guidance in my backyard. By the way, what kind of fertilizers do you use? I've recently planted some petunias and—" Mrs. Owen sat there, utterly taken aback as Catherine carried on. The elderly woman was a whirlwind of energy and chatter, posing questions and providing her own answers in the same breath. Will approached the two women, a genuine smile spreading across his face. He then turned to Mrs. Owen, his voice filled with warmth. "Normally, she doesn't talk this much, but I guess she hasn't had someone to talk to in a while. Mrs. Owen's initial confusion and surprise slowly transformed into a serene expression, her face now adorned with a peaceful smile. The weight of her worries momentarily lifted as she found herself swept up in the lively conversation with Catherine. The two women connected instantly, their shared love for gardening bridging the gap between them. Catherine's genuine interest and willingness to listen brought solace to Mrs. Owen's heart. It was as if a spark of companionship had been ignited, brightening the path ahead. In that moment, Mrs. Owen realized that she wasn't as alone as she had feared. The presence of Will and now Catherine reminded her that there were people who genuinely cared and were willing to offer their support. The once looming panic began to dissipate, replaced by a newfound sense of hope and camaraderie. A few days before Mrs. Owen's scheduled discharge, Will and his mother Catherine had a heartfelt discussion and made a compassionate decision. They both recognized the challenges that Mrs. Owen faced and understood the importance of providing her with ongoing support. With empathy in their hearts, Will and Catherine decided to take care of Mrs. Owen. They knew that her circumstances were difficult, and they wanted to ensure that she didn't have to face them alone. They saw the strength and resilience in Mrs. Owen, and they believed that she deserved a helping hand during this transitional period. Together, they made arrangements to accommodate Mrs. Owen's needs. They prepared a comfortable room for her in their home, ensuring that she would have a peaceful and nurturing environment. They also arranged for any necessary medical equipment and supplies to be readily available, understanding that her well-being was of utmost importance. Will recognized that his mother Catherine could benefit from the companionship and shared understanding that would come from caring for someone like Mrs. Owen. He understood that his mother's retirement years had been marked by a sense of loneliness and a longing for meaningful connections. Seeing the parallel experiences of abuse in their stories, Will realized that Mrs. Owen's presence in their home could bring solace and healing not just to her, but also to his mother. It was an opportunity for them to support and uplift one another, forming a bond built on empathy and shared experiences. Dakota peered at Will, her eyes widening in admiration. A wave of warmth enveloped her heart, kindled by Will's considered action. Remaining silent, she stood in place, her gaze fixed on him, her lips curving into an unfeigned smile. Catching her quiet observation, Will swiveled around, and for the first time, he took note of the captivating sparkle in her eyes. "Can I help out with your gardening?" Dakota asked, her voice filled with a playful tone. She held a deep respect for the family's kindness and yearned to give something back by looking after Mrs. Owen as well. Will's face lit up in a responsive smile. "Absolutely. Feel free to join us any time. And keep in mind, our doors are always open, not just for gardening." With that affirmation, the group ambled out of the building, leaving Dakota alone. She stood watching, her eyes tracing their departing figures until they disappeared from sight. "That's a good lad." Startled, Dakota spun around to find Mrs. Lewis standing behind her. "I believe he's the finest young man I've encountered yet," she admitted with conviction. A mere 7 days had rolled by, and surprisingly, Mrs. Owen's recent hospital stay had almost vanished from her memory. Had it not been for the restricting yet supportive wheelchair she was obliged to use, the elderly woman might have completely disregarded the incident. They chatted about yesteryears and new age innovations, discussed delightful recipes and books that helped their interest, reminisced about favorite vacation spots, and even debated on matters of the heart. In a shy, almost hesitant voice, Dakota expressed to Will her desire to visit and spend some time with his family. On hearing this, Will fought hard to maintain his composure to not let the excitement seeping through his veins become apparent. Within him, a fountain of joy was threatening to explode. The girl he had been secretly cherishing had expressed an interest in spending time with his family. With an admirable poker face, he watched as Dakota walked away to resume her usual rounds with the patients. The moment she was out of sight, Will darted into a nearby room, safely away from prying eyes. Unable to contain his joy any longer, he let out a triumphant yell, the sound of pure elation reverberating through the empty space. His heart raced with joy, the anticipation of Dakota's impending visit lighting up his world. News of the blooming connection between Dakota and Will spread like wildfire through the hospital corridors. A wave of collective happiness washed over the staff, their faces lighting up with smiles at the thought of the delightful pairing. Fast forward a few months, and Will and Dakota were officially a couple. Their weekends were a pleasant blend of laughter, comfort, and shared affection spent at home with Catherine and Mrs. Owen. Dakota's sense of humor was infectious, her witty comments and amusing anecdotes adding a playful energy to their gatherings. Dakota had not only won over Will's heart, but she had also captured the hearts of his family. One sunny afternoon, as they lounged in their backyard, the soft chime of the doorbell pierced the tranquil ambience. Dakota, who was closer to the house, volunteered to see who it was. The sight that greeted her as she opened the door was utterly unexpected. Olivia stood on their doorstep, a freshly baked, warm apple pie cradled in her hands. The tantalizing aroma of the pie wafted through the air, tempting Dakota's senses. "No, I don't have any romantic feelings for Will, so you don't need to worry," Olivia quickly clarified, reading the surprise on Dakota's face. "He's just not my type. I'm here to apologize for the harsh words I said in the past." A sigh of relief and a broad smile spread across Dakota's face. She reached out, welcoming Olivia in a comforting hug. The gesture was received warmly, and Olivia's expression softened. Dakota took the pie from Olivia's hands, admiring the perfectly golden crust and the sweet scent of apples and cinnamon. The rest of the afternoon passed in peaceful camaraderie. They sat together in the living room, the tensions of the past set aside. They nibbled on the delicious apple pie, washing it down with warm, aromatic tea, the atmosphere imbued with newfound understanding and friendship.
"This is going to be our home now," Kevin said, his tone final. "The rest of the stuff will arrive today, so please make sure everything is in place." I stared at him, feeling the weight of his words sinking in. "Why are you deciding this on your own?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. This wasn't something we had discussed, not even once. "Oh, and by the way," he continued as if he hadn't heard me, "Anna's coming too. Please welcome her." Anna? My mind raced. Kevin's older sister had always been distant, and now she was coming here. Our new home? Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. Ever since we moved into this high-rise condo, his family had been visiting more often, but this was different. It was bold, sudden. It felt like an invasion. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I had to know. The moment Kevin came home from work, I confronted him. "Your mother and her family? They're moving in with us?" My voice was low, controlled, but the tension hung thick in the air. "Oh yeah, that's today," he replied with a nonchalant laugh. "Didn't I mention it?" His laughter made my skin crawl. How could he be so casual about something so monumental? I felt my chest tighten with disbelief. "No, you didn't," I said, my words sharp and fast. "And why would you make this decision without me?" Kevin shrugged, the smile never leaving his face. "Don't make such a big deal out of it. We'll adjust." Adjust? I could barely breathe. This was our home, a place that was supposed to be our sanctuary, and now it felt like I was being pushed aside, as if my opinion didn't matter. "Don't just stand there," Kevin said, brushing off my concerns. "Start dinner. We're celebrating tonight." As I moved around the kitchen, anger bubbled beneath the surface. How could he decide something so huge without me? This was supposed to be a fresh start, a place for us to build a life together. But now, it felt like the walls were closing in. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there she was, Kevin's mother. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "If you hate living together so much, why don't you just leave?" she said, her voice laced with contempt. Before I could respond, she tossed an envelope onto the table. "What's this?" I asked, my heart pounding. "It's severance money," she replied with a sneer. $10,000. Take it, get divorced, and leave. We'll take the house." I stared at the envelope, the weight of their plan hitting me all at once. They wanted me gone. They had been planning this from the moment we moved in. I looked at Kevin, hoping, praying, for some sign of regret or hesitation. But he just stood there, a smug smile on his face. That's when I knew. I wasn't just losing the condo. I was losing the man I thought I loved, but I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I grabbed the envelope, feeling the crisp bills inside. $10,000 to leave my life behind? They thought I'd just walk away. But they didn't know what I was capable of. Fine, I said, my voice calm, almost too calm. I'll leave, but don't think this is over. Kevin and his mother exchanged glances, their smug smiles growing wider. They thought they'd won, but in reality, I had already begun plotting my revenge. I packed my bags quickly, almost laughing at how eager they were to see me go. As I walked out the door, my heart raced. Not with fear, but with excitement. They had no idea what was coming next. I went straight to my father's house, my mind already piecing together the perfect plan. My father owned the high-rise condo we lived in. He had let us stay there rent-free, as a wedding gift of sorts. And now, Kevin and his family thought they could just take over? Not on my watch. When I arrived at my father's house, he could tell something was wrong. "Sarah, what's going on?" he asked, concern etched on his face. I took a deep breath and told him everything, about Kevin's betrayal, his family's plan to move in, and the envelope of money they had given me to leave. My father's face darkened with anger. "They think they can just take over my property?" he asked, his voice rising. "We'll kick them out immediately." "Wait," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I have a better idea." My father raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" I laid out my plan, and as I spoke, his anger melted into admiration. "You always were the smart one," he said with a chuckle. "Let's do it." The next day, I called Kevin. "About the condo," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I've decided not to fight you on it. I'm going to transfer the ownership to you, then it'll truly be yours." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. You're serious?" he asked, disbelief coloring his words. "Yes," I replied. "I don't want any trouble. I'll take care of the paperwork. You don't have to worry about anything." "Wow, Sarah," Kevin said, his voice bright with relief. "Thank you. I didn't expect this." I hung up the phone, logically unable to contain my grin. He had no idea that the real trouble was just beginning. A week later, the paperwork was finalized. Kevin and his family officially owned the condo. They thought they had won. They thought they were free. But then the first bill arrived. "Hey, Sarah." Kevin's voice was shaky when he called me. "We just got a bill for $6,000. What's going on?" "It's the rent," I said, barely hiding my amusement. "Living in a high-rise condo isn't cheap, you know." "But we didn't have to pay rent before?" he shouted. "Of course not," I replied, my voice cool and calm. "When I lived there, the rent was covered. But now that you own the condo, you have to pay." Kevin was silent for a long moment. We can't afford that," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "That's not my problem," I said with a shrug, even though he couldn't see me. "You wanted the condo. Now it's yours." A few days later, I received another call, this time from Kevin's mother. "We can't pay this rent," she said, her voice shaking with barely concealed rage. "You need to fix this." "I don't need to do anything," I replied, enjoying the power shift. "You're the ones who wanted the condo. Now it's your responsibility." "You're a horrible person," she spat. "We're family." "No," I said, my voice cold. "We're not. You made sure of that when you tried to push me out." She hung up the phone, and I could practically hear the panic in her silence. As the weeks passed, the bills piled up. Kevin and his family couldn't keep up with the payments, and soon they were drowning in debt. Every time they called, I let it go to voicemail. I didn't need to hear their excuses. Finally, they were forced to move out. The high-rise condo that they had so eagerly claimed was now empty, and they had nothing to show for it. They lost everything, just as I had planned. But I wasn't done yet. One day, while I was going through my mail, I noticed something strange. A credit card statement, one I didn't recognize. As I looked closer, I realized what had happened. Kevin and his family had been using a credit card in my name, racking up thousands of dollars in debt. I could have let it slide. But where would the fun be in that? Instead, I hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit. It didn't take long for Kevin and his family to realize they were in even deeper trouble than they thought. Not only were they being evicted from the condo, but now they were being sued for credit card fraud. The court case was swift. The evidence was undeniable. Kevin and his family were ordered to pay back every penny they had stolen, plus damages. They were left with nothing, no home, no money, and no way to rebuild their lives. And I got the condo back. My father, ever the generous man, transferred the ownership back to me once the dust had settled. I moved back in, this time without Kevin or his toxic family hanging over me. As I stood on the balcony of my high-rise condo, looking out over the city, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had been through hell, but I had come out stronger on the other side. Kevin and his family were nothing more than a bad memory now. They had tried to break me, but in the end, they had only destroyed themselves. And me? I was free. Free to live my life on my terms, without anyone else holding me back. As the sun set on the horizon, I smiled to myself, knowing that this was truly a new beginning.
After I moved out, my connection with my family deteriorated even further. They took legal action after seeing the house I had purchased and demanded that my sister be awarded the house. They were left with a $12,000 debt after losing the lawsuit. I've been thinking about this for a while and wondering if I need help. I may simply be trying to communicate how I feel, but I've always felt unloved in my family. Despite being 5 years younger than me, my sister Margaret and I have never gotten along. Everything seemed worse after her birth. I had the impression as a child that she was the focus of my parents' universe. I was viewed as only another person around her, who was the golden child. I may be exaggerating, but it's obvious that something was wrong when I look back. For instance, Margaret got a brand new, fully configured PS5, which I had desired, for Christmas last year. I only owned a pair of basic white socks that I purchased from Walmart. They were the only present I received beneath the Christmas tree, but that doesn't really matter. Margaret was selecting presents like a small animal searching for toys while the family was assembled, and there were smiles everywhere. Everyone in the home was excited for her during this time. A modestly wrapped present was in my hands. I sat there, wearing brand new socks, trying to grin while everyone else looked away. Surprisingly, this was not a unique incident. This is how my life has always been. Not even my birthday is remembered by my relatives. They hadn't celebrated it since I was 10 years old. It has already been forgotten, and last year I celebrated in private with my college mates, without receiving any congratulations from my parents by email, phone call, or words of congratulations. On the other hand, Margaret's birthdays are always a big deal. Last year, for her 16th, my parents threw a lavish party. Family and friends were all invited, and amazingly, a trampoline was set up with entertainers and magicians called in. The house was filled with decorations, and everything was catered professionally. It was like a festival. However, I wasn't even invited to her birthday party, and I didn't know this fact until the day before. When I asked my parents, they explicitly stated they did not want me to participate. To be honest, I was overwhelmed with my studies at the time. That day, I just went out with friends, focusing on distracting myself from the situation. Still, even when sharing time with my family, I felt as if I wasn't really part of the household, and I couldn't shake off the loneliness. But as my own birthday approached this year, a faint hope emerged that maybe something might change. I had given up on expecting much, but I thought maybe they would acknowledge my existence. However, there was no change. The day to spend with my college friends came again. They organized a small but fun party in the dorm. It was a good time, but it was different from being with family. A birthday, even a small one, should be celebrated with family. Margaret's birthdays always made me acutely aware of what I was missing. I remember when she turned 10, my parents decorated the entire house with pirate adventure themes. For my own 10th birthday, I was just thankful to have pizza. The pain isn't just from having fewer presents or parties. It's from feeling unnoticed and unvalued, and that this will always be the case. I always kept up good grades, stayed out of trouble, and tried to do what was asked of me, but I realized that it wasn't important. Margaret was always a person who drew others to her. She was sociable and good at sports, possessing qualities completely different from mine, and my parents were very happy when she was born. I remember the excitement when Margaret was born. I imagined we would become best friends, playing video games and getting along like in the movies. But it quickly became clear that Margaret had little interest in me. She enjoyed sports with her friends and always drew attention. I felt as if I were being forgotten entirely. As I grew older, I began to harbor resentment towards her. Initially, I told myself that it wasn't her fault, but she was beginning to understand the extent of her influence. My parents never blamed her for anything. I was always the one blamed, even when she made mistakes. My parents would just laugh it off. When Margaret broke the TV, she blamed it on me. Her friends were over, and somehow, the TV fell off its stand, nearly breaking completely. When my parents came back, Margaret pointed at me and accused me of causing it. I wasn't even home at the time, but my parents believed her, and I was grounded for a month and had my phone taken away. I was treated like a criminal. After that, I withdrew into my own world, spending most of my time in my room or at friends' houses. I desperately wanted to leave home, but every return reminded me of how worthless I felt. My room was a small, suffocating space in stark contrast to Margaret's room, which brimmed with the latest electronics and posters of her favorite sports teams. She seemed to have her own little empire, and I felt like an invisible shadow. My 18th birthday was unforgettable. I had a slight hope that it might mark a new start as an adult, but I was let down. That morning started like any other. My mother was busy in the kitchen, my father was engrossed in the newspaper, and Margaret was absorbed in her new Xbox. There were no congratulations, no presents, not even a word to acknowledge my birthday. I felt completely ignored in this house. At that moment, I realized nothing would change. Only Margaret was treated specially. She had taken all the love and attention from me and from our parents. I don't know if she was aware of this fact, but she didn't make it an issue by her actions. I grew to hate her more. I took the necessary measures. That is, I distanced myself from my parents and arranged my life so I didn't have to witness my sister Margaret's blatant favoritism. Being neglected by my family was draining me internally. Because of this, I chose to avoid contact with them. I moved out as soon as possible and started living with university friends. Honestly, there was a sense of relief, like being freed. But I had to make a living. I began freelancing using my talent in graphic design. At first, it was simply to support myself, but gradually I got more work, received higher evaluations, and became involved in larger projects. I worked tirelessly late into the nights and over the weekends. I was determined to build my success independently of my family ties. Then, at the age of 24, a wonderful opportunity came my way. It was meeting a person named Todd. He had all the qualities I was looking for and was the ideal partner. He was intelligent, ambitious, and had a generous heart. He was also freelancing, specifically managing social media for small and medium businesses. We hit it off right away and started collaborating on various projects. We supported each other and grew in our respective fields. In fact, he was the first person who made me feel like I wasn't just part of the background. He truly understood me and loved me, not for what I could do for him, but for who I was. His care was not out of obligation, but from genuine feelings. As our career stabilized, we began to dream bigger futures together. After dating for a year, we moved in together. Things progressed smoothly. We made a bold plan to dip into our savings and buy a home. We were not looking for just an ordinary house, but something special. After a long search, we found a sprawling 3-story house in the suburbs. It was more expensive than we expected, but we managed to pay for it with our combined income. We were very happy. It was truly our dream, a result of our joint efforts. We signed the contract and became the official owners. 3 days later, the real trouble began. 3 days after we moved in, I got a call from my family. At first, I didn't even feel like answering since moving out. We had barely spoken, and I had avoided conversations because they were awkward, but the calls kept coming persistently, so I finally answered, and for some reason they said, "We've arrived in town and want to stop by your new home." I was conflicted but agreed to their visit. I should have been more discerning. I thought it best to just get the visit over with rather than avoiding them indefinitely. A few hours later, my parents and Margaret, along with a man I had never met before, appeared at our new home's entrance. From here, things got even stranger. Margaret had many favorites. The man she brought was her fiancé Isaac, and Margaret was pregnant. Yes, Margaret was soon to be a mother. Not a single person had told me that my sister was engaged, let alone the fact that she was expecting a child. That was a wake-up call for me. Before even entering the house, my father started making passive-aggressive comments. "Oh, so this is the house you bought? I didn't think you could afford something like this," he said, in a way that seemed to look down on me, but I didn't let it bother me. I wasn't in the mood to argue. When they entered the house, the atmosphere became even more awkward. My mother tried to talk to Todd, but he sensed something was off, glanced at me, and asked what was going on here. At that moment, my father and Margaret were whispering, and Isaac was acting as if the house belonged to him. Then suddenly, my father made an unexpected statement and began to speak decisively. "I think it makes sense for Margaret and Isaac to move in here, to build their family and make space for the baby," he stated arrogantly. I was so stunned by his words that I could only stare. "This place is too large for you and Todd," my father continued, ignoring how upset I was. "Margaret and Isaac really need a large place like this to raise a child. You two don't need all this space." I couldn't believe my ears. My father looked me straight in the eye, and what he said next made me feel indignant. "This is no joke. It's time for you to step aside. You should give up what your sister needs. The family should come first, and she is starting a new family. You and Todd can find a smaller place. This house is more suitable for them." I was devastated. Years of resentment suddenly overflowed. This home is Todd's and mine. We bought this house, and it's in our names. No one else gets to make decisions for us. Margaret then interjected with a smug look. "Wait a minute. I can't see why you need such a large place. Unlike you, we have a child." "That's not the issue," I exploded with anger. "The problem is that you're claiming what's mine as your own and trying to take it away. I've lived a repressed life for too long. I can't take it anymore." At that moment, my father became very aggressive. He stood up, puffed out his chest, and berated me high-handedly. "You should be grateful," he said. "It's shameful to live in a house that's beyond your means. If you give it to Margaret, she won't have to feel that way, will she? Besides, they aren't demanding the keys. They're just asking. Whether you like it or not, this house becoming Margaret's is inevitable," he added. At that point, my anger finally erupted. Unable to grasp what was happening, I lunged at my father and pinned him against the wall. "Get out of this house right now!" I shouted. Todd tried to calm us down, but I couldn't stop. Years of anger erupted all at once. My father pushed back, and without realizing it, we were fighting and yelling at each other. My mother and Margaret were screaming, and Isaac was frantically making a phone call in the corner. The fight didn't stop until the police arrived. It must have been Isaac who called the police. The situation spiraled out of control, and they separated us, handcuffed my father and me, and took us to the police car. I never thought it would come to this. I never expected my father would try to take the house from me, and as a result, I ended up in jail. Hours later, Todd paid my bail, but the damage was already severe. My family was irreparably broken, but it wasn't over yet. Things got even worse. My father cunningly decided to sue me over the house, arguing that Margaret and Isaac needed it more than I did, demanding that I hand it over. He actually took the matter to court. I couldn't hide my shock at his audacious actions. Thus, we went to court. I hired a lawyer and gathered all documents proving the house was registered in my name, preparing for the most crucial battle of my life. However, I had something hidden. There were traces of mental and psychological abuse I had suffered over the years, and I intended to reveal them. I collected evidence, emails, text messages, and even witnesses, including friends who had observed my parents' behavior towards me over the years, were gathered to testify. We brought all this to court. My lawyer emphasized not only that the house belonged to me, but also that I was a victim of neglect and psychological abuse in the past. The trial lasted several months, and my father used various tactics to demean me. He portrayed himself as a loving father who was doing his best for the family. Meanwhile, Margaret and Isaac played the victims, pleading that they needed the house for their baby and condemning me for not giving it up as selfish. However, they were not successful. When the verdict was finally announced, I felt relieved of a huge burden. The court ruled in my favor and further ordered my father to pay $120,000 in damages for the mental and psychological abuse. For the first time in my life, I felt that justice was served, as someone stood up for my rights. Following the judgment, I decided to completely cut off contact with my parents and Margaret. I could no longer endure the manipulation, falsehoods, and unfair favoritism. Together with Todd, we finally made the house truly ours and began building a new life, though the scars from the past had not fully healed. Even now, as I write this, it's unbelievable to think how much my parents tried to deceive me. Margaret had once been the favored youngest child, but that situation has changed. It has been about 3 years since then. Before continuing this story, let me tell you about our wedding, which took place 3 years ago. It was the happiest day of my life and the best decision I've ever made. Having overcome complex family issues, Todd remained my steadfast support. After the court battle with my father, it was confirmed that Todd was the only person I could truly trust. We had a small, intimate ceremony with just Todd's close friends and relatives, without inviting my parents, sister, or any other family members. The manipulation, abuse, and subsequent litigation they had subjected me to were incomprehensible. I didn't want their toxic behavior to ruin my wedding day, as I had fully realized their true nature. However, a few days after the wedding, I received a long, guilt-inducing email from my mother expressing how hurt she was for not being invited. How she found out remains unclear. My father did not attempt to contact me, which was fine by me. But Margaret seemed to have lost her self-control. This was predictable. Margaret had always been the golden child, constantly striving to please our parents. She never accepted responsibility for her life, always shifting blame for her mistakes onto others. Although the court's favorable decision and the ordered payment of $120,000 to me affected my parents' finances, it did not bankrupt them, but their financial flexibility was significantly reduced. Spoiled throughout her life, Margaret could not handle this new reality. She believed she had a right to inherit the house my father owned, but she could not make that a reality. Her demands for a large sum of money were just the beginning of her disappointments. Her fiancé, Isaac, left her a few months after the trial. Reportedly, Margaret had a miscarriage due to mental stress. It all felt like my fault. The sequence of events, my father losing the lawsuit, facing financial difficulties, and Isaac leaving Margaret, seemed to be blamed on me. Then the situation completely changed a month into our marriage. As Todd and I were adjusting to our new life, we enjoyed the peace of being free from family toxicity. One day we decided to take a walk in our neighborhood. As we strolled down the quiet streets, we breathed in the fresh air, refreshing our spirits. It was supposed to be a normal day. We had walked about half a block when we encountered Margaret. She was standing on the corner, staring intently at me, her eyes filled with anger. My heart froze in an instant. I hadn't seen her since the trial, and I couldn't understand why she would suddenly appear near me. Confused, I yelled, "What are you doing here?" Before I could grasp the situation, she charged at me with an iron rod, apparently taken from a construction site. I tried to retreat, screaming, but she was too fast. She swung the rod and hit my abdomen before I could react. Pain shot through me instantly, sharp as if my ribs were engulfed in flames. I bent over, gasping for breath, but Margaret's attack was not over yet. She swung the rod down again, this time aiming at my feet. The rod struck my left shin with a sickening sound, and I collapsed weakly onto the sidewalk. "You ruined my life," Margaret continued to shout, trembling with anger. "It's all your fault. You caused our father's financial collapse. It's your fault Isaac left. Everything broke because of you." I managed to stand and try to defend myself, but my body wouldn't move properly. I'm not sure how much time passed, but gradually I heard voices growing louder in the distance. There were shouts from people around and footsteps rushing towards me. I saw someone grab Margaret and pull her away, but my consciousness was fading, and I couldn't grasp what was happening. When I regained consciousness, I was in a hospital bed. Todd was sitting beside me, his face pale, and his eyes red with tears. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and my body screamed in pain. "Are you okay?" Todd whispered as he gripped my hand tightly. "I'm okay," but I was far from okay. I had multiple broken ribs, a fractured left leg, and a broken right arm. The doctor told me it was fortunate that I had survived. If it hadn't been for the bystanders who intervened, Margaret might have killed me. I had to call the police to stop her. Margaret was arrested at the scene and handcuffed while I lay bleeding on the sidewalk. Afterwards, my consciousness faded, and I remained in a dazed state under the influence of pain medication. My body slowly began to recover, and during that time, Todd stayed by my side constantly. He managed everything, including the police reports, insurance paperwork, and hiring a lawyer in preparation for the upcoming trial. A trial was scheduled because Margaret faced serious charges for assault with a weapon, and given the severity of my injuries, she was looking at a long-term sentence. Once I was conscious and could understand the situation, Todd explained everything to me. After being abandoned by Isaac, Margaret had a mental breakdown. She fell into severe depression and, according to the police report, refused to acknowledge her own failings, instead shifting all the blame onto me. Margaret, who had waited outside my house for hours and brought an iron rod from a nearby construction site to attack me, told the police she did not regret her actions. When questioned by the police, she justified her behavior by claiming that I had destroyed her life and was merely seeking justice. She truly believed that I was the cause of all the problems she faced, including her fiancé leaving her and her father's financial troubles. I spent a long time in the hospital recovering from my fractures, and every day was painful. The ongoing physical therapy, relentless medical examinations, and the looming pressure of the trial weighed heavily on me. I couldn't walk for an extended period, and even after being discharged from the hospital, I needed crutches and arm support for a while. The doctors warned me that it could take months to fully recover, and there was a possibility that I might not completely regain my prior level of function. Months of treatment and recovery later, the trial against Margaret began. Margaret pleaded not guilty, holding on to the misguided belief that her actions were absolutely justified. She felt that I was to blame for the situation that had influenced her actions. Her defense argued that she acted out of mental distress and that a series of familial events had destabilized her mental state. However, the evidence presented in court strongly suggested her guilt. Eyewitnesses to the incident had seen Margaret's attack on me and had immediately called the police. The prosecution submitted detailed medical reports of my injuries and police reports that included evidence of Margaret's premeditated attack. It was clear she had come to my home with the intent to harm me. Sitting in court and watching my sister try to justify her actions against me was more heart-wrenching than any hardship I had previously endured. Throughout the trial, she never once looked in my direction. To her, it was as if I no longer existed. But perhaps the most gut-wrenching moment was seeing my parents not only appear in court, but sit by Margaret, listening and nodding as if in agreement every time she claimed I had destroyed her life. Their nodding was like a knife twisting in my chest. Despite such betrayal, they still chose her side. They seemed to firmly believe she was the victim, and their support for her remained unchanged. The trial lasted several weeks, but the verdict was almost predetermined from the start. From the courtroom atmosphere and testimonies, the outcome was anticipated. Margaret was convicted of serious assault charges and was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison. She would be eligible for parole in 3 years. Following the legal process, honestly, that fact no longer mattered to me. I had accepted the reality of being without a family. Through this ordeal, it became clear that those who were supposed to be my family were not true family at all. But at least, throughout everything, Todd has been an invaluable presence, steadfastly supporting me. He faced every difficult situation unflinchingly, always standing with me and providing strong support. We are focused on moving forward positively. I am gradually recovering both physically and mentally, and I'm starting to see a brighter future ahead. Little by little, I continue to receive therapy consistently to overcome the trauma of past events, but it's a slow and lengthy process. There are days when I feel better than the previous day and can genuinely appreciate my progress. However, there are also challenging days when it's hard to face myself. The reflection in the mirror feels starkly different from who I once was. I cannot predict what the future holds, but I've resolved to cherish each day as it comes. And now, at least, I have a clear understanding of who I can truly trust.